Welcome to this BAKERpedia seminar all about shelf life extension. I am Dr. Lynn, your host for today. This seminar is brought to you by LaSalle North America. You may know LaSalle for their world-class baking yeast and 170-year heritage, but you may not be familiar with their elite technical team, one of them here today, and the other innovative ingredients they have developed. In addition to their fresh, dry, and deactivated yeast, LaSalle offers a range of innovative and high-quality baking ingredients for any application or process. From buns and rolls to pastries, bagels, pretzels, tortillas, and more. Learn more about them at lasafrebaking.com. That's LESAFFRE baking.com. Our next sponsor is Comprehensive Process Solutions. Comprehensive Process Solutions collaborates with forward-thinking clients to ensure their success and growth. Leveraging their experienced network of professionals, they provide comprehensive support that integrates the concepts of science as a service. I love that. SaaS, science as a service, in a way that delivers tailored science-based strategies and solutions that empower our clients to excel. Learn more at cprocesssolutions.com. That's C, letter C, processsolutions.com. Today, we are joined by Dr. Cheryl Cropper. Cheryl Cropper is the new product development lab manager for LaSalle Corporation and Red Star Yeast Company based in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Welcome, Cheryl. Cheryl has been working in the research and technical services group for the past 10 years, where she develops ingredients and provides technical support to her team and customers. Cheryl received her bachelor's and master's in food science from the Ohio State University. Go Bucks! Woo! And her PhD in grain science from the Kansas State University. Go Power Cats! Yeah! Now, let's dive into the world of shelf life extension. I am going to make a short presentation before we invite Dr. Cropper over to share a few words on their solutions. Okay, so what is shelf life extension and why is it important? We want to talk about food waste, the big elephant in the room. We produce so much food at such a high-paced environment in order to reduce its cost that sometimes as food manufacturers, we forget that if these food do not get bought up at the supermarket shelves, it gets thrown away. So according to the experts, over 1 billion tons of food waste was produced in 2022. And of that, 19% is thrown out at the retail level. So why? Because they grow mold or they develop an off flavor on the shelves. So today's seminar is just to help you along as a food producer to understand how you could prevent that, how you can target that 19%, bring it down some more, okay? We are going to cover, what affects food product quality, what really defines shelf life extension, the factors affecting shelf life. We talk about some advanced technology today, and definitely ESL by categories of, bread, cakes, donuts, and such. Okay. All right. So we are talking to high-speed bakeries today. And as a high-speed baker, you are to provide delicious, nutritious products that stay longer and stay fresher on the grocery shelves or at your food service customers' restaurants, right? So with a better understanding of the shelf life of your product, meaning you yourself as a food manufacturer has the responsibility to understand how far your product can last on the shelves, even though it's left your docks, right? You are responsible for that. So in understanding that, you can really understand what is, how to maintain the overall quality for it. A longer shelf life would actually improve your production efficiencies by reducing changeovers. So instead of, say, producing one bread SKU 3 times a week, you can actually reduce that to 2 times a week. Make your product go longer, reduces the changeovers, increasing, higher efficiencies. Um, Also, it can also reduce delivery frequency, and therefore waste, basically any kind of take back from the grocery store, you could reduce that as well. So, improving shelf life doesn't only provide a better customer experience, but it also improves the bottom line for your company. So we want to define shelf life extension as the period, shelf life is the period in which baked products is suitable for consumption based on quality and not just safety. Okay. So what does that mean? That means sensory characteristics, okay? It needs to taste good, it needs to smell good, it needs to look good, it needs to feel good. Like, 2-day-old bread shouldn't feel like croutons, right? And then it needs to be perceived in a way that your customers talk to each other. Oh, this is like really good product. You got to buy this, right? So those are all sensory characteristics. Microbiologically, it needs to be safe. It needs to be free from listeria. It needs to be free from E. coli. It needs to be free from yeast and molds, most importantly. Okay. Last but not least, physiochemical properties. So this portion is important because I don't think too many people are trained on it. And a lot of people who are put into the positions of QA and QC don't really necessarily understand texture or rancidity, oxidation that causes rancidity, the parameters and conditions of how you could store the product before it produces off flavors. So these are the things that we're going to be talking about as well. Okay, so we talk a lot about this in our pocket guide, and basically shelf life should always stem from your water activity of the product. Okay, if your water activity is really high, right at the 0.9 to 1.0 area, as you can see, this is like the best region for growth for yeast and bacteria. As you go down into the 0.4, 0.5 region, mold growth reduces. And so does everything else, but texture just does change. Okay, and as you go down, way down to 0.5, that's when nothing really exists, right? So no bacterial growth, no microorganisms, but a big but, if you're producing something like, say, dried noodles or crackers, right? You need to take note of lipid oxidation as you go down on the curve. And that's why lipid oxidation increases. So it's most beneficial for a lot of people that produces really dry baked goods to really watch lipid oxidation as you go down on water activity. Okay, so here are a few examples of what water activity looks like and how it feels like to the layperson who really don't understand water activity. It's not moisture, it's not product moisture, it's a different dielectric measurement of water. Okay, you use a water activity meter to really record water activity. You don't use a moisture analyzer to record water activity. Okay, so I wanted to show this slide with you, and this is available in the pocket guide that breads and all the beautiful things that like to mold, they're right down here above 0.9. As you put in more sugar and more fat going into waffles, muffins, snack cakes, you are going to bring down the water activity, okay? Because sugar really binds water, all right? And when you go down into nutritional bars, filled cookies, pastries, you're gonna further bring down that water. And when you go into like dried noodles, like I said, crackers, cookies, the water is going to be so low that your only problem might be just oxidation and rancidity. Okay, microbiological characteristics. Mold. We want to prevent mold as much as we can. And bacteria like rope. Rope is really something that can really grow and migrate into the product. So we see this in some muffins and some soft cake products, especially. Okay, so the only way to really approach microbiological concerns is number one, to keep your facility clean, to use gloves and really approach it like a sanitized environment. Okay, that's a number one step. The number two step is really to make sure that the environment, the air is always filtered, is always clean. There's no flour or mold dust floating around. Okay. Number three is then to use anti-mold ingredients. And hopefully that's something that Dr. Cropper is going to share. And, we talk about it a little bit more in the pocket guide as well. So when we talk about ingredient composition, we want to shed light on the ingredients that actually lower the water activity for the product. We know that sugar does that. Sugar and honey are huge humectants, so they will bind the water and bring water activity down. Okay, salt does the same thing too, but you can only use these two components to a certain extent before the product gets too salty or, the total added sugar count gets too high, but this is the biggest difference I see when someone tells me, hey, Lynn, my bread X with honey doesn't mold as fast as my bread X without honey, and my bread bread X is with honey, bread Y is without honey. So bread Y, molds 3-4 days faster than bread X, right? This is the reason why. It's because there is not enough sugar in there to bind the water. It's not because honey has a special property, because honey is usually used at a very low level too. It's not going to have that kind of effect on mold. It's just that the water, the sugar content affects the water activity. So you'll see this in all the products that you produce, that the one with more sugar is always going to mold later. Okay. Does that mean that you add in more sugar? Not really. It's just make sure that you clean up, make sure that you package it as fast as you can when it comes out of the oven, after it cools. So those are the things that you need to consider as well. And if all these don't work, then think about natural extenders like cultured wheat or, other natural ingredients. Novel ingredients also include some enzymatic solutions I've seen so far that does reduce the water activity slightly. Again, environmental conditions are really important. Make sure that you keep it as a really clean room where the bread comes out or cake or cookies come out the oven. Many times I see cake producers not really conscious of this. They would leave the cakes out and then come back later in the day to package them or to ice them. And that is not right. So, cooling methods wise, you need to cool it to a certain temperature, and usually takes really for cakes less than an hour. It shouldn't be sitting, being exposed to the air for more than an hour, really. So if you can get the cakes and the bread packaged as soon as possible after it's baked, because it's sterile, when it comes out of the oven. After it's sterile, cool it really fast, package it. And when you package it, make sure that your employees use gloves if they're going to touch the product, and also not use any self-enhance way. I like to put it in a better word, because I've seen employees blow in the bags just to open them, and that's not right. So, keep it sterile, don't touch the product, don't blow on the product, just package it. That's the best way to keep out mold and bacteria. We talk about advanced technology. So cooling can be advanced if you use vacuum cooling. Okay. I like to encourage that, because with vacuum cooling, you can really cut the cooling time down by 80 to 90%. But when you use vacuum cooling, you have to realize that you have to bake less, because the moisture is all going to come out and it's all going to be sucked out in the cooling process. Okay. So the balance needs to be there in terms of vacuum cooling, but vacuum cooling is the best way to cool a product. If you're still using the spiral and the different conveyor cooling systems, make sure that there is dedicated air that is filtered that blows onto the product. If you don't do that, then all the air that is in the bakery gets blown on the product. Not good. Okay. And the best cooling systems that I have seen that is available is a CIP process on the conveyor belts every 24 hours, right? So the 24 hours, every 24 hours, the conveyor belts get sanitized. So there needs to be a break in the line for that. Sometimes it will take 45 minutes of a break. Sometimes it will take 3 hours, depending on how manually constructed your cooling tower is. Okay. So cooling is key to extending your shelf life. All right. Freezing. Yes. Molds and bacteria don't survive, like they don't grow during the freezing process. They will grow after the freezing process, but if you implement a freezing process in your logistical distribution, you are going to extend the shelf life of your products for many months, in fact. Okay, so if you want to get to if you're a producer on the East Coast and you want to get to your customers on the West Coast, freezing is the best technology to use. Okay. And we're not just talking putting everything in a box and freezing it. We're talking about blast freezing. Okay. Blast freezing means you freeze the product down to a certain internal temperature before you package it. All right. And that's key in maintaining proper product quality. All right, so next we talk about baking process optimization. That means that if you can really thermal profile your process and make sure that there's enough water, just enough, don't drive out all the water, just enough water in there to really get to, if you guys do thermal profiling right now, 20%, that's what I always recommend. 20% above 200 for bread, right? So when you get to that level, cooling is going to be faster. because there's less water in the bread. Okay, less water in the bread means less water needs to come out of the bread in the cooling process, means it cools faster. Okay, so if you can optimize your process that way to reduce cooling time before packaging, that would be the way to go. UV treatment has been a recent technological advancement in the bakery field. However, UV treatment doesn't do the underneath side of the product unless you can flip the product over. So I haven't seen that done yet, but this particular process has been seen in tortilla, where it's easy to flip the stuff over, right? So UV treatment is also, I would like to say, effective if your conveyor belts are sanitized all the time and you just treat the top of the product. Okay, so that's one way of doing it. Basically, it kills mold spores, right? It's not going to deal with other kinds of bacteria. So just to let you know that that's what we found out so far. There could be advancement pretty soon to treat other kinds of bacteria, but we are just not there yet. Okay. So packaging solutions, we want to talk about that because in the recent years, we've seen things being blown onto bags and using the bag as a solution. But that particular solution has not really found traction in the industry. Not because, I have any opinions on it. I just think it works well. It might not be cost effective. Other solutions would include, modified air packaging. And yeah, basically, I've also seen, this is not a packaging solution, but I've also seen things being sprayed onto bread before it's packaged. So that's also another way to go without using actual antimicrobials in the bread itself. But I feel like these last two solutions are kind of like when you want your product to really go 6 to 9 months, right? Really long time. But for the fresh bakers of bread and cakes, the real solution is really to clean up, to use ingredient solutions, and to optimize your baking process. Okay, in the guide, we talked about these different categories of bread, snack cakes, cookie, and tortilla. So you can go in depth into understanding, your category, how you can extend the shelf life of your category with the ESL solutions. All right. So we are encouraging you to download this guide, and thanks to LaSalle and CPS Solutions, we are able to offer this guide for free. So go there now and download the guides. And before we go into Q&A, we have a special segment from LaSalle, and Dr. Cropper is going to present on their behalf. Dr. Cropper?
Thank you. I will share my screen here. Well, thank you for the invite today, and I'm really excited to get to share with you about extending shelf life as well. And as Dr. Lynn said, there are a lot of things that do have to be considered when looking at extending shelf life. I'm going to focus more on the ingredient-based side of it, but essentially giving you a little bit of understanding of why you choose what you choose and the best options in that space. So we'll start with the beginning as far as understanding functionality. So when we look at ingredients to be added to bread, as far as helping to extend the shelf life for softening or anti-staling effect, we really have to look at the mechanism. So, why do we choose certain solutions? And that's really comes down to it that the starch is going to gelatinize or go back through recrystallization or retrogradation, no matter what, as soon as you pull it from the oven. So in effect, you could still have all those nice external properties to make sure your product is safe for long term, but internally it's automatic going to do this. So we do have to look at solutions that can help to prevent that from happening, because that essentially is going to be the cause of scaling for you. So, and that's essentially the restructuring of that starch. So when we look at what type of attributes that restructuring occurs or affects on the bread, we really want to look at certain key attributes. And I'm going to speak to why you choose what you choose in ingredients based off of essentially of how to evaluate the bread. So there's two ways of evaluation for looking at the change in that bread crumb over time. And of course, the first one is an analytical method or analytical equipment, and that's a good measure. And we'll speak to that here shortly. But really, it's coming down to that sensory evaluation. So at the end of the day, your product, once you want your buyer to buy the product more than one time. So it's really going to be back to the factors of that sensory analysis. So what's happening on my crumb or on my inside that bread system that's going to make a customer not want to come back to that. So how do we evaluate for that? And that's really critical at the beginning. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the key things to think about when evaluating a piece of bread for that anti-staling effect. So the first one will be the core one, which is firmness. Essentially what you can do is you can take your bread slice and you're going to press on it and see, does it feel hard or is it soft? And you're going to want to do that for a certain period of time. So you probably will have to set up your own sort of small shelf life study with your packaged bread to see, what does that change look like? And so, of course, the key thing is taking your bread and feeling it and seeing, oh, does it feel hard? And that's the number one thing. And you can set your anchors based off of something that's ideal and then something that's extreme. And that way you can train your company or your colleagues to do that measurement on your own and to really gauge that firmness change. And then once you have product from the field that you want to evaluate, your trained panel internally will be able to make that judgment call. And so, like, for example, we might have a range of 0 being like hard, like super hard, I call brick hard, or being a 10 is super soft, like almost like so tender that it melts in your mouth. So just kind of having those gauges on where you want to be for that firmness measurement. And so that will always be the key one for most consumers, because that's the first thing they're going to notice right away is that firmness. But some other key attributes that you may want to look at as you go through the softness evaluation is looking at that resilience. And so what is resilience? So resilience is basically that spring back of that bread. And so when you press the bread, does it come back like a sponge or does it stay in place? And that really simulates what the chew's like. So when you taste the bread in your mouth, does the chew, does it stick to your teeth? Does it fall apart real quick, or does it have some resilience and holds together and you have to chew a little bit in between before you swallow? And so that's a good measurement too. And that's those two factors, the firmness and the resilience, will be critical for really gauging that extended shelf life or how that bread's changing over time. And so we would also build a measurement here. So you can have a measurement of 0, like elastic and very springy. So it springs back right away when you touch it, or does it form into a gumball and it just stays in a wad once you start testing it? And so that would be your another benchmark or anchor at a 10. And then you can gauge where you want to be. And some regions really like that gumminess in their bread, and some regions don't prefer that. So you just have to gauge, what is your ideal bread for you? And if that gumminess is it, feel free, go for it. We can help you with that too. And then the other key attribute, and I think this is a little more new, and as Dr. Lynn spoke earlier about, that moistness coming out of the bread and making sure that you have the ideal for cooling, but that moistness is really key also as an attribute for scaling, because we found that with moistness in the bread, even if the crumb seems to be a little bit harder, if it's still perceived as moist, it still can be acceptable to customers. And so that third attribute is a really kind of more, I'd say, modern into the anti-staling ingredient space, because we can see that the added moisture really does bring a value add. So that some way to test that is you put your bread on the table and you can basically put your hand against it, and if it feels cool to touch, then usually that is an indication of moistness, so that when you chew, you may not need to use as much saliva to do that swallowing. So it's another attribute that can also be a good measure for essentially the next phase of your anti-staling study. And then the fourth one would be foldability. So you think about, does my bread hold up over time? And this one's a good key one for dryness, because if your bread is super dry, it's not going to stay, it's going to break. And so those are the other things that another way of testing for that anti-staling is, okay, is it folding? Is it breaking? So I can see my shelf life is probably not going to be as long as I'd hoped if it's already starting to do that within 2 to 3 days. And you can usually see that first at the edge in the cracking. So So, and then of course the tried and true, most consumers in the market will do this, and basically you just go to the bread and squeeze it and see, does it spring back? Is it holding it together? And so this is an easy way for a consumer to do a measurement. And so this is another good way for you as well, because you know the consumer's doing it, so you might as well mimic what they're doing. So it's a good idea to have a gauge on, okay, if I squeeze the bread, is it retaining the shape, or does it seem to start to like get too hard? Or, and it's another good measurement, an easy way for you to do at your bakery to decide, okay, this is a quick shelf life study. So just as a little caveat here, so a lot of the things about doing these testing, you know, you can train your own panel internally as far as how to exactly figure out what is best for your system and your baking. And again, this will come as you start deciding to play with ingredients and what you want to use for this system. So one thing LaSaF does offer is they do provide some technical tools for you if you're in need for helping you to figure out what is the right wording for your sensory testing and what kind of attributes you should really look for as you start moving into the space of ingredient testing. So they can do sensory mapping for you based off your benchmark, and we can also do tailor-made trainings. So little plug there, but essentially too. And then also there are guides based off product type. So obviously one size doesn't fit all. So pan bread attribute may not match pizza attribute. So it is good to have an understanding, and there LaSaF can offer books on training on essentially what kind of wording might be best for your sensor profile to do the shelf-life extension for your product. And then, of course, the tried and true is always the analytical methods for doing this. So obviously the touch and sensory feel is going to be part of it, because you can't 100% marry analytical without that sensory step. So you have to have both. But having those quantitative numbers are also useful for that. So if there is an opportunity for you to do something like with analytical testing for compression using texture analysis, this is critical and something that could be very valuable to your product. So samples, things like using texture profile analysis, which measures that crumb softness, also that resilience and spring back. But also, if you aren't making breads, there are other options within that space that include measuring firmness using puncture for crispiness, if you have a pizza or something like that. Tortilla or flatbreads don't use the same attributes, so there's ball probes and things that can be used to the attachment to the texture analyzer, and then things like cohesion and softness. So there are ways to do that. Obviously, LaSaF can support you with that, but these are some of the more technical things that can really gauge, you know, how your product is changing over time, and I think is very valuable for you because you have analytical data to back up your sensory data. So just as an example, showcasing what the texture at TPA might provide for you. So here's a sample of a product that we have on the line. And you can see that essentially that higher the number on that texture analysis measurement in that first graph here usually is indicative of a harder crumb. And then you can see over that time period of 7 days, that change in that crumb. But by adding an ingredient, as you can see with the black line, you can see a change in the softening over time. And so you can actually see a variable effect of how it really does have an impact on that bread. And that should marry well with as you touch and taste the bread as well. Same way with the resilience, you know, if it's more resilient, it's going to be more linear. And of course, it also drops over time. So looking at the comparison, and so you do have a benchmark control for these tests typically, but having the addition of an ingredient can really provide a big impact on presenting that staling, because mostly what we're using are enzymes to help cut down that starch, and that helps to basically restructure the molecule in a different way, and that really helps to slow that process of providing that hardness in your crumb. So now it comes to how do we choose the right anti-staling option when we're looking at your different products. So the first thing is the type of product. You know, you're not going to use the same essentially solution for a tortilla as you possibly will with a pan bread, and that has to do with the bake. You bake tortillas slightly different than maybe you would bake a pan bread, or the formulation has a lot more sugar than the tortilla might have, vice versa. So it will depend on that product, and that's the first question. So what do we have? And so if you're coming to a supplier or ingredient company, you know, we might ask these questions up front to kind of gauge so that we can provide the best solution for you to answer and solve all the problems that you need. Here we have. The second thing, of course, as Dr. Lynn spoke earlier, is the formulation. You know, having a high sugar dough, something high or low is going to have an impact on the type of cocktail essentially that you're going to use for anti-staling in your product. So we might ask that up front too. So that would be something to think about. The other thing that is essential to think about is the pH. You know, most breads are kind of in the mid-range and it's not too bad, but when you start working with some specialty things like sourdoughs, or you start dropping the pH a little bit, you know, that's going to have an impact on the ingredient you choose as well. So it's important to to think about that when you start talking to suppliers. You know, what is the best option based off of these attributes that I might have in my product. And of course, what is your shelf life? Are you looking for 1 to 3 days? You're looking for 21 days? So the solution may be tailored based off of that, essentially what length of time you're looking to have in that shelf life. So you might suggest one cocktail over another, just because, you know, you're looking for that specific time frame. And of course, as we went back to the first attributes, you know, are you looking just for softness only? Are you looking for a combination of softness plus resilience, or softness plus resilience and moistness? So those type of solutions are going to vary too, based off of the attributes that you want in that bread for that length of shelf life. So, you know, some things to consider. And so it's more than just, I just need a solution, because it may not be the right solution if you don't have an idea of what exactly you're looking for as far as characteristics. And of course, are you already using something? Do you need to add more? Do you need to dose it higher? Do you need to add two? Like there's a questions that are important to ask yourself, especially when it comes to costs. Because I mean, if you already have something in there and you don't think it's working as well as you want, can you dose it higher, or should you switch it out? Some of those solutions are really critical for you to ask yourself when you're talking about these ingredient additions. And then of course, the type of packaging, as Dr. Lynn mentioned, you know, having the right packaging will also influence the length of your shelf life. So making sure that that is optimized for your system is also a good idea. So LaSalle has a lot of solutions. I'm not going to go through each one, but just so you know that we do have them tailored based off of the length of shelf life you're looking for, the specific attributes you're looking for, whether that's the softness or softness resilience plus moistness, as well as targeted for specific products, whether that's donuts, whether it's buns and flatbreads, or even tortillas. So, because like I said, it's not going to always be one size fits all in these systems, because you know your raw material is changing and your process changes. So it is really important to, you know, have an idea of what makes sense for you, and that's why we have lots of solutions for that. And then the other thing too, we've done with our global sensory group, we've also done a mapping of our ESL solutions to give you the specific attributes. So if you want to come to us and ask us if we want something that specifically gives me tenderness, moistness, and foldability, you know, I know exactly where we should put that based off of what our descriptive sensory has said, and of course, all of our analytical testing as well. So we have a good idea and can provide that solution based off exactly what you think you need for your product. And so then moving quickly into the other options, which we talk about shifting from not only anti-staling, but we also look at antimicrobial. So thinking about the mechanism. So obviously one of the core antimicrobials now is the calcium propionate. It's a source of propionic acid. And so we add this to the dough because it really gives us a great function to help produce those mold spores and mold growth in your bread, in addition to cleaning your bakery and making sure that everything is completely, sterile on your side, that to make it from the standpoint after bake. But obviously, sometimes you need a little bit of help, and so that's what currently is CalPro is the most common. It's more efficient once you put it in the active form, which is the undissociated form, and that really is related to the pH. And so that's one thing we talked about anti-staling, as well as antimicrobial will have a pH will be very important in this case. And this is just a graph showcasing the active propionic content. And you can see here the the dashed lines here showcasing the different pH levels against the y-axis here that has the total active propionic. And as you can see, if we go from a 5.5 pH down to a 5.0 pH, we increase our activity about 20%. So in solutions, looking at antimicrobial, that really has a big impact, because that can extend your shelf life from 10 days up to 25 days, having that efficiency in that antimicrobial product.
I just wanted to point out,
yes.
Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you, but I just wanted to point out so many people don't share this information. So thank you so much for sharing this, because our audience need to understand that pH is key, right?
Mm-hmm.
pH is key, and look at that, just 0.5 doubles the efficacy
exactly.
of CalPro. And
yes,
just want to say thank you so much for sharing that.
You're welcome. Yeah, no, I think it's important because it's a good question when we think about formulation. Like, you know, everyone thinks they put more in of an antimicrobial agent, and that's not always the best, because you don't have enough acidity to help make that more efficient. So,
you know, I've also had so much request on, can we go above 0.35, right? Can we go above the legal limit? What's going to happen when we go above the limit? And I'm just like, don't. Reduce your pH first. Do all these other things first, you know. So this is a great graph to show why.
Well, I'm glad I could share it today. And so just another way to kind of gauge too is, and one of the things when you develop an ingredient, you have to understand the efficiency. And as you said, we lower the pH, but how do we know for sure? And so one of the ways that, from our standpoint, from a technical standpoint, we use a system called transillumination, where we actually inoculate the bread and then test the ingredient efficiency. And basically what it is, you inoculate the bread and you put it into this machine that basically is a controlled box that takes a picture of the bread every basically very consecutive period of time to see exactly when that mold grows. And that's how we determine the efficiency. And this is really great for, this is a little bit more technical for a bakery, but this again gives you an idea of, when people make solutions for you, we're not just like putting sand dust and things. We are testing to fully understand our ingredients as well as to make sure it works for you. And so just to give you an insight, so we do have offerings. I know that, calcium propate is still a very popular item, but now a lot more bakeries are moving to the more clean label options. So we do have natural mold inhibitors, which are based off cultured wheat or flour or cultured wheat starch. And that's really due to provide another source of probionic, because it's a fermented wheat flour with organic acids, mainly being propionic as the core one. And again, we do sell these with the combination of citric acid, which is the acid to help make them more efficient, as we've shown earlier, and some pH or some flour for standardization. And so these new combinations of improvers, as included with the anti-staling as well as the anti-molding, have really helped to extend shelf life for many different products. And it gives a lot more versatility on what you can use now on the market. So anyways, I just want to thank you for your time today and for your participation. I'm honored to be here. And so if you have any questions, please feel free. But we'd love to be your solution partner. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you for that great presentation, Cheryl. So now we are going to go into Q&A, and let's hope we can have enough time to finish this up within the hour.
Yes and no. So there is essentially the standard anti-staling enzyme is called multigenic amylase, and that one is really difficult to overdose. It usually works as is, but then when you start coupling it with other enzymes and making a full cocktail, sometimes it can be challenging because if you don't hit your bake temperature on the outside, sometimes those enzymes don't fully get, they do inactivate, but you still have some side activity following up. So it just really depends, but typically no, usually don't have an issue with overdosing, but it really just depends on, what cocktail you're using.
I would like to add to that too. Overdosing on enzymes is very expensive, so don't overdose. I think it's a natural thing that that prevents bakers from overdosing.
So if it's your first time adding an enzyme cocktail or an anti-staling agent to your blend, usually you should probably start with the recommended dosage. These products are usually formulated with an ideal amount in mind to give you the full maximum amount of enzyme to provide that solution. And so if you don't know for sure and you're just in there playing by yourself, I would start with the recommended dosage and just see what effect that gives you up front. And then you can always adjust after the fact, or even return back to the supplier and ask for more questions based off of your trials, because at the end of the day, it's always going to matter down to your process and your formulation. So as much as the supplier can provide suggestions and levels of dosing for you, you will have to try that in the field in your bakery and find out. So.
Yeah, and in addition to that, that's an excellent answer, Cheryl, by the way. You have to understand what is your expectation for the product. Do you want it to be 7 days soft, or do you want to be 30 days soft? That's a huge difference in application of enzyme for those two things, right? Is your product a croissant, or is it bread, right? So that's another question altogether. It's like product application wise, what are you using it for? And that's how you're going to determine, how to get the most out of your anti-staling enzymes. I think like Cheryl mentioned, the go-to is Kelpro, right, for bread.
Yeah.
For cakes, it would be potassium sorbate, right? But we understand now, like how I don't like I need to get back into like the history of bread and things like that. Stop me if you don't want to listen to this story. But why are we putting things inside of bread and cakes when it's on the outside, right? Most of the mold happens on the outside, right? So basically, I would like everyone to focus on using gloves and clean up first, okay? And then determine what you're going to put inside. And since we know that already, why aren't we using natural mold inhibitors? Because they are a great substitute for Calpro, right? Calpro was used at a time where people didn't have any other alternatives. They just reach for Calpro. Now we have cultured wheat, we have pH, we have all these other tools in our toolbox to deal with, right? So I've actually had bakers come to me and say, we don't want Calpro in our systems. We just don't want that on our labels. So go to the natural way of cultured wheat, reducing pH, like Cheryl said, and then just make sure that your environment, supports that system as well. So what do you think? What's your solution?
No, I mean, I agree in that respect, but I also think back to, like, you remember when they used to have rope spores in your bread. So I think some of that was the early of, you think about your raw material, and again, it also comes back to
Sure.
your critical control points. So making sure you hit your bake temperatures and that sort of thing. And you're right, if you don't hit those components, yes, you will have surface mold. So I think some of that relates to having that in the product too, just to prevent some of those non-things that were not necessarily monitored as closely back in the earlier, before these like new solutions have been brought out. So
That's true.
it's quite well. The thing is, when you start adding calcium propionate at a higher dosage, you also have a more buffering effect on your so I don't necessarily know, like, from the standpoint, if you're adding more, you're increasing your effectiveness actually goes down a little bit. Like, say if you go from you have your pH at 5.5 and you have it at say 0.5 and you add it at 1% because you're adding more, like, then that's going to increase the pH. So that is not necessarily going to give you the extended shelf life. I mean, however, if you also reduce it and you're closer in the 5 point, you go down and you're at 5 point, let's say 5.0, you should have more efficiency, but then you just have to make sure you still have enough ingredient in there that's going to give you that shelf life. So you might be able to hit the pH, but again, if it's still not at a high enough dosage, you still have factor that in too. If you're looking for 90 days and you have it at 0.25 now, I don't necessarily know if that will equilibrate out either. So it's a sweet spot. You got to have the right dosage and you got to have the right pH. So it's a balance.
Yeah, that's correct. And if you're talking about bread systems, it really depends on what kind of bread and dough system you have. A straight dough system is not going to give you added fermentation to bring that pH down. But if you use a sponge and dough and you have a longer dough final fermentation time, like 45 minutes, an hour, you are going to reduce that pH. So try to figure out these things first naturally on how to reduce the pH before you increase the calcium propionate level. And that's really important because, I mean, fermentation time and citric acid actually is much cheaper than Calpro. So, you gotta give those considerations as well.
Yes, costs will come into it as you start adding more. You're not going
Correct.
to be
Yeah.
cheaper. So,
Mhm. Mhm.
well, in the sense of, like, I mean, there's bacterial amylase, which is not exactly a maltogenic amylase. Those are two different types. I mean, um, I mean, for core anti-staling, maltogenic is the standard, and you can do combinations with bacterial amylase. You can also do combinations with standard amylases, and sometimes lipases also do have a positive effect on extending the shelf life too. So it's usually said it could be a combination, it could be a single, and it really depends on the shelf life you're looking for. So, and the system. So,
Interesting.
I mean, are you looking for like softness or
That's a good question. Like I don't know why you want to go up on the gluten level, but I would go as low as possible. Does that make sense? If you're having a resiliency problem, I wouldn't go up on the gluten level. But staling has, I mean, this is why maltogenic enzyme works, because staling is mainly controlled by carbohydrates, right? That's why the enzyme works. So yes, there is a theory out there that protein has, somewhat of a function in staling, but not as huge as carbohydrates. So the real answer to this question is I don't think gluten level really affects shelf life in terms of resiliency. But I do question, why would you want to go higher up on the gluten level of the flour, right?
Then you
Unless you
have to,
only have
sorry.
one flour source, and then you have to use bread flour for tortilla making, which I would ask you to reassess that whole situation, because that's not a good idea.
Because I think with you having more gluten, it's going to tighten your tortilla as well. So you
I
have,
know, I know. It's not, it's too expensive to do it that way.
I would say mostly it's going to be in the ballpark of where the bread is now. I would say usually bread comes out around 5.5, 5.7, and if it's extreme cases, it goes as low as 5.2. I mean, that's kind of the key spot is in between like the 5.2, 5.5. Once you start getting lower, around closer to 5 or below, then you really start to have an effect on that efficiency of that enzyme. And then that may end up with having to dose it a little higher to get that same shelf life. So I mean, there is a sweet spot, obviously, for the most efficiency, but it's usually in that where the range of where most baked goods are anyways. I think the key thing really is not getting it super low. When you start looking at sourdoughs and things like that, that's when it gets a little trickier.
Yeah, and I would like to point out that Dr. Cropper talks a lot about pH, and sometimes bakeries don't have access to a pH meter.
Sure.
And I can tell you right now, it's easy. Like it's easy to just buy a pH meter and get understanding of your process and your pH. Because if you don't, then you are really working in the dark. You're putting too much Calpro. You're doing things that are not, like, why are you fermenting longer just to bring down the pH and you don't know what pH is. So, so those things is like buy a pH meter. And if you really need instructions and how to measure the pH of your dough, go to bakerpedia.com. We have step-by-step ways of teaching you how to do the pH of your dough. Okay.
And also your suppliers can help too. If you really want to send samples, then we can run the pH as well. So
Oh, really?
mhm,
That's wonderful.
we do support our customers in that respect.
Oh, that's
So
awesome. But how are you going to send a live dough to your place?
so there are portable probes, and our tech team will go in the field, and they actually do have the portable probes.
Uh,
But the final product, usually we just have them send the final product because you can usually gauge. Kind of now, I've spent a year in France doing a research study on this, so
oh,
you can
okay.
kind
Well,
of
do
gauge,
tell.
you can gauge essentially where your dough's at, kind of off your pH of your crumb. So
Oh, really? Okay. Nice
yeah.
to know. All right.
um, Good packaging.
Enzymes, man. You gotta
Yeah,
use the
yeah.
enzyme, because if you don't do
Enzyme,
the
good
enzymes,
packaging,
it's gonna be crumbly. It's going to be crumbly.
and I would say with cookies too, like your bake, because like depends on if you're how much moisture is in there to begin with. So if you don't have a lot of moisture, it may be okay for a year. But if you lose a lot of moisture over that time period, that may have an impact on that shelf life too.
Yeah, and I assume like the first stop that you need to do for a cookie shelf life study is your water activity. You need to
Yeah.
understand truly your water activity. If it is at a point where it's not going to support mold bacteria growth, you don't need to worry about putting in any kind of preservative, right? But for sure, you need enzymes in there, you need emulsifiers in there, you need lots of fat in there so that you can keep your like the moist texture without being it crumbly. I think the biggest issue with cookies is just crumbliness when it gets to that year, right? And also understand your packaging, like what Dr. Cropper say, if your packaging has some kind of metal component to it, like some people like to package their cookies in foil or some kind of aluminum packaging, make sure you have chelating agents in there so that it won't turn rancid or give you a kind of off flavor. And I hate to say this, but I would just put chelating agents in there. Antioxidants. I would look into antioxidants into cookies that are going to last that long on the shelf, because if you don't, your chocolate chips or your fat and the instability of logistics, because you don't know it's going to be distributed in winter or in the midst of summer, the temperature goes up and down sitting on the shelf on the supermarket. You can't control that, right? What you can control is the active oxidation that happens in your cookie, and that can only be addressed through using antioxidant ingredients, and you can look that up through BAKERpedia. And also chelating agents if you're using some kind of metal-based kind of packaging.
Yes, we can happily help support you on that. We do, I said, it's texture analysis we can run, and we can also have a sensory, and we have a global sensory team that does provide trainings on sensory as well as doing internal sensory testing for customers. So we do have the capabilities to support for sensory analysis.
All right. So thank you everyone for your questions. It's been such an interesting session. So thank you, Dr. Cropper, for coming on. I really appreciate your time and your effort in joining the discussion. And thank you everyone for joining us for this BAKERview on shelf life extension. Please don't forget to download the Baking Shelf Stable Products Pocket Guide to keep learning. Okay, so download that right now, and we will see you soon. Have a great day. Happy baking.